We created them. We chose them as the basis for perfection. They were weak, primitive, unremarkable, but their bodies hid a secret. Nature gave them the gift of survival, and we gave them power. We believed we could control evolution. They didn't just survive, they adapted. They changed. Now they're after us. We thought they were made for fighting, but they were made for the end.
The primogenitor drifted in the black sea of space, its massive frame casting long skeletal shadows across the faintly glowing nebula. Within its cold, sterile halls, the air was thick with the metallic tang of recycled oxygen, and the rhythmic hum of machines echoed endlessly. The Zalvaran, with their smooth, pale skin and bioluminescent eyes, moved with the unhurried precision of a species that had mastered patience. For over a millennium, they had been the undisputed architects of life in the galaxy, their experiments creating countless bioweapons, obedient servants, and engineered predators. But this was their magnum opus. Deep in the restricted sectors of the ship, the research dome housed the culmination of their work. A shimmering array of stasis chambers, each containing the latest iteration of their experimental soldiers. Rows upon rows of cylindrical tanks glowed faintly, filled with a viscous amniotic fluid. The forms inside twitched occasionally, skeletal shadows of what they would soon become. Most bore traits of apex predators, elongated limbs for speed, reinforced claws for tearing through armor, and neural pathways designed to suppress fear and amplify aggression. The Zalvaran scientists worked tirelessly, their long fingers dancing over control panels, monitoring the nutrient infusion cycles and adjusting the genetic configurations as needed. They spoke in sharp, clipped syllables, exchanging data and theorizing about their creation's performance in the upcoming trials. The humans had been an afterthought when the Zalvaran first harvested DNA from Earth. It had been out of simple curiosity. The species didn't exhibit anything remarkable: primitive technology, fragile physiques, and a limited understanding of the universe. But upon deeper analysis, their potential emerged like a buried blade glinting in the sun. Unlike most species, humans possessed a genetic resilience that allowed them to survive in a range of hostile conditions. They adapted faster than the Zalvaran thought possible, their bodies capable of rebuilding themselves in the wake of injury, their minds driven by a primal will to endure. It was this adaptability that intrigued the scientists enough to incorporate human DNA into their prototypes. The early results were promising. The hybrids developed increased endurance, sharper cognitive abilities, and an uncanny knack for problem-solving under stress. The scientists decided to push further, amplifying their aggression and suppressing their moral instincts. The Zalvaran High Overseer, a towering figure named Dravik, had watched the progress with growing fascination. Standing before the largest stasis tank, he observed the prototype within. A human hybrid, taller and more muscular than any baseline specimen, its veins pulsing faintly in the fluid. Its eyes were closed, but Dravik felt uneasy under its lifeless gaze. "This one," Dravik said, his voice a low vibration, "has surpassed all expectations. its combat capabilities should rival the Tharnian war beasts, perhaps even surpass them. Another scientist, Taluvek, nodded but hesitated. Overseer, there are anomalies in the neural readings, increased activity in regions associated with decision-making and memory consolidation. It's unprecedented. Dravik's mandibles twitched in what passed for amusement. You fear it will outthink us, Taluvek? No, Overseer, Taluvek replied quickly, his bioluminescent eyes dimming. But these traits were not part of the design. The human DNA, it's unpredictable. It reacts to stimuli in ways we cannot fully control. I recommend we... Enough, Dravik interrupted, his voice sharp. Control is the essence of creation, and we are the creators. These humans will serve their purpose, as will the prototypes. Begin the deployment. The command rippled through the research dome, and preparations were made to transport the prototypes to Eris Crucible, a terraformed moon designed to be a living nightmare. The moon had been sculpted with care, its environment an ecosystem of hostile flora and fauna. Acidic rain pelted its surface in unpredictable torrents, while carnivorous plants towered over canyons, teeming with predatory creatures. It was a proving ground, an arena for the prototypes to demonstrate their worth. The first wave of hybrids was released onto the moon's surface. At first, everything unfolded as expected. The humans adapted quickly, their combat strategies evolving in real time. They worked in packs, their movements efficient and coordinated. Against the moon's native predators, they were brutal and effective, learning to use their environment to their advantage. But the anomalies began to emerge almost immediately. In the first week, a prototype was observed consuming one of the native predators, not out of necessity, but with an almost ritualistic deliberation. Its body began to change within hours, its musculature thickening, its skin hardening to match the scales of its prey. The Zalvaran scientists monitored this with curiosity, noting the acceleration of its metabolism. By the second week, more hybrids displayed similar behaviors. Injuries that should have been fatal were healing at impossible rates, and their bodies were mutating in ways the Zalvaran couldn't explain. Bone spurs erupted from joints, jagged and weaponized. Eyes became more sensitive to light, allowing them to see in the pitch-black night. The humans were no longer merely surviving. They were thriving, feeding off the horrors of the moon and becoming something far more dangerous. Dravik watched the data feeds in silence, his unease growing. The humans had begun to hunt the moon's predators not for food, but for sport. They no longer fled from danger, they sought it out, almost as if testing their limits. Their movements became erratic, their tactics more brutal. And then, one day, a team of Zalvaran observers stationed on the moon went silent. The last transmission showed a blurry image of a human hybrid standing over a Zalvaran corpse, its distorted form dripping with blood. Its eyes glowed faintly in the dark, and its mouth, filled with teeth that seemed too sharp and too numerous, twisted into something that could only be described as a grin. This wasn't part of the plan, Taluvek murmured. For the first time, Dravik had no response. The world of Eris Crucible was a landscape of nightmares. What once might have been a carefully controlled testing ground for the Zalvaran's creations had devolved into an unforgiving death trap. The moon's terrain was a shifting nightmare of acidic bogs, forests of serrated vegetation, and carnivorous pits that opened without warning. The Zalvaran had lost control weeks ago, and those who remained on the surface, researchers, soldiers, and the hybrids, were left to fend for themselves. Gavrin clutched his pulse rifle, his 4 eyes darting in every direction as he crept through a stretch of twisted jungle. He had learned the hard way that movement in the open was suicide. The once carefully maintained biomes had grown wild and unpredictable, their balance thrown into chaos by the humans' influence. The predators, once isolated and controlled, now roamed freely, hunting anything and everything indiscriminately. The humans were no longer the prey. Gavrin had seen them, if they could still be called them. He had watched one emerge from the dense mist of the jungle, its body a grotesque fusion of humanity and something far worse. Its spine jutted out at sharp angles, forming a ridge of bone spikes. Its eyes glowed faintly in the dim light, scanning its surroundings with unnerving focus. Its movements were unnaturally quick, its steps silent even over the brittle undergrowth. He had barely escaped that encounter, but the memory lingered in his mind, gnawing at him. The humans were no longer fighting for survival. They were hunting, evolving with each kill, and shaping their bodies to match the environment in horrific ways. The Zalvaran survivors had dwindled quickly. At first, they had relied on their superior technology and knowledge of the moon's layout. They had set traps, fortified themselves in research outposts, and attempted to regroup. But the humans adapted faster than any plan could be executed. They sabotaged defenses with an intelligence that should have been impossible for engineered hybrids. They avoided traps, feinted retreats, and lured Zalvaran soldiers into ambushes. Gavrin had heard the screams over the comms, each more desperate and short-lived than the last. One by one, the outposts had gone silent. Now he traveled alone, his only goal to reach the northern extraction point, a desperate hope that someone, anyone, would still be monitoring it. As he pushed deeper into the jungle, the air grew heavier, tinged with a coppery metallic smell that made him gag. The ground beneath his boots felt spongy, the soil slick with a viscous black liquid that didn't match the moon's documented biochemistry. The jungle around him seemed alive, the twisted trees and vines writhing subtly as though reacting to his presence. He froze as he heard a sound, soft, rhythmic clicking. It echoed faintly through the trees, growing louder with each passing moment. His 4 hearts pounded in unison as he crouched low, his rifle aimed toward the direction of the sound. Then he saw it, a human, or at least what had once been one. Its body was a grotesque mockery of its former shape. The flesh on its chest had split open, revealing muscle and bone reinforced with something metallic that glinted faintly in the dim light. Its arms were unnaturally long, tipped with claws that twitched with eager precision. Its face was still partially human, but its jaw had split wide, revealing rows of jagged, uneven teeth. It moved with terrifying speed, darting from tree to tree, its eyes locked on him. Gavrin felt his stomach drop as he realized it wasn't alone. Shadows moved in the periphery of his vision, circling him. The rhythmic clicking was joined by a low, guttural growl that seemed to reverberate through the trees. He turned and ran. The jungle blurred around him as he sprinted, the creatures in pursuit. Branches lashed at his face, and the ground shifted treacherously beneath his feet. He could hear them closing the distance, their movements disturbingly coordinated. Suddenly, the ground gave way, and Gavran tumbled into a pit of slick mud. The air was knocked from his lungs as he struggled to his feet, his rifle lost in the fall. He turned to see the creatures circling the edge of the pit, their glowing eyes watching him with unsettling patience. One of them stepped forward, its claws scraping against the bark of a tree. It tilted its head, studying him like a predator deciding how best to kill its prey. Then it did something that froze Gavran's blood. It smiled. The gesture was alien and wrong, the edges of its mouth pulling too far, revealing rows of sharp, broken teeth. The others began to echo the expression, their faces twisting into grotesque imitations of joy. Desperation flooded Gavran's mind. He scrambled for anything he could use as a weapon, his fingers closing around a jagged piece of stone. Just as the creatures began to move toward him, a deafening roar split the air. The ground shook violently as a massive form crashed through the trees, a hulking predator native to the moon, all teeth and muscle. It slammed into one of the humans, sending it flying into the pit's edge. The others turned, their attention momentarily diverted, and Gavran seized the opportunity to climb out of the pit. He didn't look back as he ran, the sounds of the creatures fighting fading into the distance. His legs burned, his lungs ached, but he didn't stop. The extraction point was close. He could feel it. When he finally reached the clearing, he collapsed to his knees. The northern beacon stood tall, its faint blue light still pulsing, a sign of hope. But as he looked closer, his relief turned to horror. The beacon was covered in blood. A pile of Zalvaran corpses lay at its base, their bodies torn apart with surgical precision. Standing among them was another human hybrid, larger than the others, its body twisted and grotesque. It turned to look at him, and for a moment, Gavran could see the faint traces of what it had once been. Then it stepped toward him, its claws glinting in the beacon's light. Gavran's scream echoed through the jungle, and then there was only silence. Lena crouched low in the undergrowth, her breath shallow and her eyes darting toward every shadow that flickered in the dim crimson light of Eris Crucible's perpetual twilight. The air was thick with humidity and the bitter stench of decay, a nauseating cocktail of rot and alien flora. She clutched the jagged blade she had scavenged from the ruins of a Zalvaran outpost, its edge uneven but sharp enough to cut through flesh if it came to that. When it came to that. Her squad had been wiped out 3 days ago. She had watched them die, one by one, their screams cutting through the jungle like the howl of a wounded animal. The first was taken in an ambush, one of the hybrids emerging from the canopy above, its elongated arms coiling around her comrade like a serpent, before snapping his neck with a sickening crunch. The others had fallen to the traps the humans had left behind, pits lined with sharpened bone spurs and sap-coated nets that suffocated on contact. The humans had turned the Zalvaren's carefully constructed nightmare into their hunting ground. Now Lena was alone. Her only goal was survival, and even that seemed increasingly unattainable. She had no way of knowing how many others were left, but every Zalvaran comm signal she tried to tune into returned static or worse. garbled voices, half-screams and distorted sounds that made her stomach churn. She knew what the humans were capable of now, and it terrified her. The jungle around her shifted, the faint sound of something large moving through the underbrush, reaching her ears. She pressed herself against the slick bark of a towering tree-like structure, its surface pulsating faintly as if alive. She held her breath as the sound drew closer, her grip tightening on the blade. The first thing she saw was its silhouette, a warped figure loping through the shadows, its movements unnatural and jerky, like a marionette controlled by an inexperienced puppeteer. As it drew closer, she could make out the details, the bulging veins visible beneath its translucent waxy skin, the spines that jutted out from its forearms, and the uneven patches of its body where its flesh had fused with something alien. Its head turned, and for a moment, Lena thought it might have been human once. But whatever humanity it had once possessed was now buried beneath layers of mutation and bloodlust. It sniffed the air, a guttural clicking sound emanating from its throat as it moved closer to her hiding spot. Lena felt the blood pounding in her ears, her body frozen with a mixture of terror and instinct. She knew she couldn't outrun it. Nothing could, but she might be able to outthink it. That was the only advantage her kind had left. The creature stopped, its head tilting as if it had sensed her presence. Slowly, she shifted her weight, preparing to lunge, knowing it was a gamble she likely wouldn't survive. But before she could act, a shrill, piercing shriek erupted from the jungle behind it. The creature froze, its elongated body stiffening, before it turned and bolted into the shadows, the sound of its heavy footfalls fading quickly into the distance. Lena didn't move for what felt like an eternity, her mind racing. The shriek had been unnatural, high-pitched and reverberating in a way that made her teeth ache. It wasn't the first time she had heard it. The first had been the night her squad was attacked, just before the jungle itself seemed to come alive, as though the environment had begun to act against them. Something was happening to the moon. She had seen the changes with her own eyes. The plants were growing faster, twisting and reshaping themselves into grotesque forms. Predator and prey alike bore mutations eerily similar to those of the humans. It was as if the hybrid's presence was rewriting the biology of everything they touched, spreading like an infection. The Zalvaran had underestimated the humans' adaptability. They hadn't just survived, they had thrived, and now they were remaking the moon in their image. Lena moved cautiously, her senses on high alert, as she followed the faint trail of disturbed vegetation left by the fleeing creature. She had no choice but to move. Staying still meant death, and the shriek had come from the direction of her intended path. She didn't know what was waiting for her, but she couldn't afford to turn back. After an hour of careful movement, she stumbled into a clearing. Her breath hitched as she took in the sight before her. The clearing was dominated by what could only be described as a grotesque altar, a mound of bones and organic matter piled high and glistening with viscous black fluid. Around it, the jungle seemed to pulse and writhe, the plants bending unnaturally toward the mound as if drawn to it. At the center of the mound stood one of the hybrids, larger and more grotesque than any she had seen before. Its body was a patchwork of scars and mutations, its arms elongated and tipped with bone-like claws. Its eyes glowed faintly, and its chest heaved with slow, deliberate breaths. Lena crouched low, watching in horror as more hybrids emerged from the jungle, drawn to the mound. Some bore familiar features, telltale signs of their human origins, but others were unrecognizable, their bodies so warped they resembled the moon's native creatures more than humans. The large hybrid at the center let out a guttural roar, raising its clawed arms toward the sky. The others responded in kind, their howls echoing through the clearing. The sound was deafening, and Lena had to bite down hard on her lip to keep from screaming. And then she saw it. The mound of bones shifted, and something massive began to emerge. Its form was obscured by the black fluid that coated it, but its size was undeniable, larger than anything Lena had ever seen on the moon. Its surface was slick and uneven, patches of what looked like human skin stretched over its bulk like a grotesque patchwork quilt. It moved slowly, deliberately, as if waking from a deep slumber. Lena's mind raced. The hybrids weren't just adapting, they were converging, fusing with the moon itself. This wasn't evolution. This was transformation on a scale the Zalvaran couldn't have foreseen. She realized then that escape might not even matter. Whatever the hybrids had become, they were no longer confined to Eris Crucible. The infection they carried wasn't just physical. It was something deeper, something capable of consuming entire ecosystems. If they found a way off the moon, the galaxy wouldn't stand a chance. And somewhere deep inside her, she understood that the end had already begun. The sky above Eris Crucible was alive with fire. Crimson streaks burned across the atmosphere as the Zalvaran fleet descended, their massive vessels blotting out the faint stars. Orbital bombardment had begun hours ago, and the once writhing jungles now burned with an eerie, unnatural glow. The moon's surface heaved like a living thing in agony, its mutated ecosystem writhing against the onslaught. Lena stood on the edge of a cliff overlooking what had once been a Zalvaran research compound. Now it was a roiling mass of flesh and biomass, pulsating as if breathing, glowing veins of luminescent fluid spreading outward like a web. At its heart stood the towering monstrosity she had seen days before, now fully revealed in all its grotesque enormity. Its form was no longer bound to anything resembling humanity, an unholy fusion of flesh, bone, and alien plant matter. It towered over the landscape, its limbs reaching skyward, clawing at the descending ships with almost deliberate intent. The Zalvaran had named it Protocol Omega, their final solution, a sterilizing wave of destruction meant to reduce the moon to lifeless rubble. Yet, as Lena watched the fleet's coordinated strikes rain down from the heavens, she knew it would not be enough. The abomination's form rippled with every impact, absorbing the devastation and growing larger, more grotesque. Its roar split the air, shaking the ground beneath her feet. She gripped the makeshift blade in her trembling hands, though it felt absurdly inadequate against the horror before her. She had no reason to believe she could make a difference, no reason to think she could stop what had already begun. But she had survived this long, and some primal, unyielding instinct drove her forward. If she was going to die, it would be on her terms, not as prey. The air around her burned as pieces of the fleet fell from the sky, their sleek forms now charred wreckage. She saw one ship explode mid-air, its debris spiraling down into the bloated jungle below. The Zalvaran had underestimated the humans at every turn, and now their arrogance was met with extinction. The hybrids had not only survived, they had turned the moon itself into a weapon, an extension of their evolving will. Lena forced herself to move, descending a narrow path carved into the jagged cliffside. Her steps were unsteady, the ground slick with a thick, mucus-like substance that oozed from cracks in the rock. Around her, the jungle shifted and groaned, its mutated flora seeming to reach for her with grasping tendrils. She slashed at them with her blade, her breathing ragged. At the base of the cliff, she entered a clearing where the ground was unnervingly warm beneath her boots. The air was thick with spores, floating like glowing embers. Her skin prickled as she inhaled, her vision swimming for a moment before she steadied herself. She could feel it now, something alive beneath the surface, something vast and ancient, pulsing in time with the monstrous form ahead. The hybrids were here too. Dozens of them circled the towering monstrosity, their grotesque forms illuminated by its bioluminescent glow. They moved with eerie synchronization, their movements purposeful yet almost ritualistic. Their eyes, glowing faintly, turned toward her as she stepped into the clearing, and for a moment, the world seemed to freeze. One of them broke from the circle, its body massive and warped, its arms elongated into jagged, blade-like appendages. Its face still bore traces of humanity, just enough to make Lena's stomach churn. It tilted its head, studying her with a twisted curiosity, before letting out a guttural roar that shattered the silence. Lena ran. She weaved through the clearing, her feet pounding against the uneven ground, the sound of pursuing hybrids growing louder behind her. The towering monstrosity loomed closer with every step, its massive form pulsating with an almost hypnotic rhythm. She didn't know what she was looking for, some weakness, some chance to end this. But the closer she got, the more she felt the overwhelming weight of its presence pressing down on her. The ground beneath her buckled suddenly, and she fell hard, her blades skittering out of reach. She scrambled to her feet, but the hybrids were already upon her. One lunged, its claws slicing through the air, but before it could strike, a deafening roar erupted from the towering abomination itself. The hybrids froze, their heads snapping toward the monstrosity, as if responding to an unspoken command. For a moment, Lena thought they would turn on her, but instead they backed away, retreating toward the creature like insects drawn to a flame. She watched in stunned silence as they climbed its massive form, fusing with its flesh, their bodies dissolving into its grotesque bulk. The creature's roar grew louder, shaking the ground, and Lena felt her knees buckle as a wave of nausea washed over her. It was feeding on them, absorbing them, and it was changing. The creature's limbs elongated, its form twisting upward until it seemed to pierce the sky itself. Its surface rippled with countless faces, human, Zalvaran, and unrecognizable amalgamations, all screaming silently. The air around it shimmered, distorting like heat waves, and Lena realized with growing horror that it was no longer confined to the moon. It was reaching outward, its influence spreading like a virus, warping reality itself. Above, the Zalvaran fleet faltered. Their final bombardment had stopped, their ships drifting as if paralyzed. Lena could see their lights flickering, their systems failing. The creature was pulling them in, drawing their very essence into itself. Lena forced herself to move, her body screaming in protest. She staggered toward the creature, her hand closing around the hilt of her blade. She didn't know what she could do, but she had to try. She wouldn't let it end like this, not without a fight. As she approached, the creature's massive, glowing eyes turned toward her, and for a moment she felt as though it saw her, not as prey, but as something else. She raised her blade, her voice hoarse as she screamed, charging forward with every ounce of strength she had left. The last thing she saw was the creature's form looming over her, its massive jaws opening wide to consume her. And then there was silence. Far above the moon, in the cold vacuum of space, a faint ripple spread outward, distorting the fabric of reality. The Zalvaran fleet was gone. The moon was silent. But the ripple did not stop. It expanded outward, moving through the void, touching distant stars and systems. The infection had begun, and nothing could stop it.